Great. Hello, my name's Erin Walter, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow in the Information Studies Department. And my presentation today is titled Reimagining Performance Art Histories, and closely aligns with my PhD research on performance art documentation strategies and models. When considering this year's topic, and particularly aligned with this panel on the future of documentation, I focus this presentation on research around the future of performance and live art documentation. Specifically, my own practice, which has produced a viable hybrid model for the documentation of performance art. This practice is especially relevant when considering performance art, which occurs out with institutions. Approaching this topic, I asked, how can artists and networks who work out with institutions and their resources best document their performance art practices and works? How can their available resources and networks of care be best utilized in these documentation practices? And how can alternative documentation techniques and methods work to produce a more comprehensive performance art documentation? I rely on two seminal pieces of theory for this investigation. Amelia Jones' 1997 piece, Presence and Absentia, Experiencing Performance as Documentation, and Rebecca Schneider's 2011 work, Performing Remains, Art and War in Times of Theatrical Reenactment. Amelia Jones, writing from the perspective of an art historian, who due to her age and logistical limitations, has experienced and written about many performance pieces based solely on their documentation, argues that the specificity of knowledge gained from participating in live performance situation should not be privileged over the specificity of knowledge that develop in relation to documentary traces of such an event. Jones notes that both experience live or in absentia are equally intersubjective. In many ways, this may be traced back to what the audience knows of the work, the artist, the context, and their personal experience in viewing, both in the moment and in later reflection. Rebecca Schneider, who writes extensively on the remains of performance, notes that when approaching live performance documentation, and with a view to a work's future and its future art history, we must be careful to avoid the habit of approaching performance remains as a metaphysic of presence that fetishizes a singular present moment. Those of us who have studied performance know that this occurs far too often, and as a consequence, a single image becomes a stand-in for a performance experience, and a single viewpoint or perspective often becomes privileged. In this way, a limited view of performance experience and absentia is granted, and those future audiences are not afforded a comprehensive experience of a work. I think this is a slightly outdated draft, so I'll just carry on from here. Speaking about obstacles of documentation, these exist both within institutions and for artists who work out with institutions. For the purposes of creating an available and accessible strategy for artists and network-led documentation, the viable hybrid model, which is what my research has produced, takes into account things like funding and human resources, also the capacity, the theoretical knowledge and practical skills which artists and institutions both come up against. From February to April 2021, I hosted a running discussion on Crumb, the curatorial resource for upstart media bliss. It's still accessible via the JustMail list, and one of the themes which arose from this discussion was representation versus reproduction. I've pulled out an excerpt from John Ippolito's post in February 2021, which highlights so well the tendency towards the creation and preservation of records rather than experiences. Further, the reliance and continued use of documentary records as souvenirs of past experiences rather than of engines of renewed experience. This focus and the importance placed on the experience rather than on the static, perhaps fetishized image is essential when considering how to create comprehensive documentation. Further, how to create guidance for self-made documentation. When looking at performance strategies, so institutional models which existed, I kept coming back to the same question, which is, of course, what needs to be documented? And then for what purpose? How do we use the documentation that we create? The image on the side is the Tate's New Media Conservation Performance Specification, which is one of the many accessible templates available online for artists and institutions. Generally, these institutions have histories of working with performance, with live art, both in their own museums, but also within their own collections, so collecting and archiving these works. Therefore, they've created models between their curatorial groups, their working groups, and their collections, which best serve the institutions themselves. Currently, there is no non-institutional documentation strategy which allows resources and practices focused towards artists and networks out with perhaps the matters in media art, which has been created by institutions, yet with a broader aim for audience. In my research, I have looked at the following documentation strategies when identifying and analyzing the landscape for performance archives and collections, both from an institutional and artist perspective driven. There are clear lack of uniformed formattings, access to materials. Some institutions provide components in the forms of templates, reports, guidance notes, or FAQs that are aimed to be utilized by artists, but this larger gap is what I'm aiming to fill with my own model, which is based on the analysis of these pre-existing models, but going further into performance works and looking how networks of care can step in and take the onus off a single artist who, again, working out with an institution may not have the funding and resources to undertake a documentation. Well, the most common documentation that we see includes photography, videography, textual descriptions with institutional focus. I've been certainly looking at techniques which expand past this, things like artist interviews and questionnaires, exhibition and performance installation and environment sketches. This pulls from notations from dance, autoethnography, and several other studies. And looking at expanded documentation techniques. So in approaching a user-led documentation model, and including Annette Decker's concept of networks of care, where several individuals within a network of a performance, so for instance, an artist, a technician, a curator, or even an audience member, take a role in creating, documenting, and storing the work. These methods of expanded documentation are useful in capturing multiple perspective, comprehensive documentation. And privileging the artist intent, as well as the performance's working specifications, visual and textual representations, audience voice, interaction, experience, and long-term engagement can provide a more authentic experience for future audiences to experience the piece, not only in absentia through a fetishized moment, but as a full experience. So my practice-led research included several implementation modes. These are mainly retrospective and live implementation, so running information through a model to produce documentation, or the aim, live implementation, which is via artist, network, or researcher. Myself as an embedded researcher within this PhD, I've generated quite a bit of data by using models on live performance works. Going forward, I continue to use these to develop the model in collaboration with artists and networks prior to the model becoming available for public use. Presently, this model is also being tested via other implementation modes. This includes artists and researchers implementing the model themselves within their own networks. If anyone in the audience is a performance artist, does live performances in such a network, and would like to utilize the model while it's still in a development phase, please do get in touch. But here we have a breakdown of tables identifying documentation activities to take place before, during, and after a performance, and facilitated by the performance's network. So while this can be done by an artist themselves, it really sees the best use by having a dialogue between two or more people. This way you can capture, the audience and the live work via visual documentation while it is happening. So these are implemented alongside an array of different documentation techniques. At times, these techniques mirror the technology employed within a performance or work to capture the documentarian or other's own experience. The viable hybrid model works to expand the performance's boundaries, looking to capture documentation from the concept of the performance all the way through its funding, its development, rehearsals, live implementation, and then through to its evaluation or long-term engagement. This could include how it is later taken into a collection or captured and engaged with on social media, how it becomes interviewed or written into history. So looking to the future of documentation, certainly the things I've pulled out and that I hope this model achieves is not only availability, but accessibility of resources and guidance to artists and networks who work within smaller institutions or out with institutions completely and who therefore lack the funding and resources. With this comes an increased authorship and ownership of one's own documentation, which at present we see very non-uniformed, especially with artists who don't have the capacity to upkeep it. The network of care, which originally was made for net art via Annette Decker's own book, really plays into the performance network as well, and not only creates the documentation, but again, allows for the archiving of such documentation. And then through the use of expanded techniques of documentation, the capturing of liveness, so the boundaries before, during, and after a performance, the performance process, the artist technique and concepts and ideologies, the experience of the audiences, the intent and interpretation, the context, and the future of a performance. So how it will be recreated, historicized, or how the documentation will be best utilized. So just a few quick slides. I've implemented the model via the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland's Contemporary Performance Practice Program, having students document other students' works. So just kind of seeing how the different formattings come and how each work creates its own experience was absolutely fascinating. A huge impact on the future of the show, and you almost end up with a kind of visual document or archive, each different and each prioritizing the own artist and documentarian's intent. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin.
Thanks.
Sounds really great. I used to study performance art when I was young, and I hope somebody would have documented it. But I don't know if even camera was invented at those times. But what about the audience? I know that I have here some colleagues who are tackling exactly the same problems.
Mm-hmm.
Does any of you want to? Okay, there, can I get the microphone to, is it Alexandru? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin, for your presentation. I'm Alexandre from the CIDOC board. I am also catching up with the exhibition and performance documentation working group that we have. I'm now the chair of that working group. So this is not really a question, but an invitation for you to join us in our discussions. We have some info and some, we are reading a lot because I only had the chair for a few months. It's performance documentation is totally new for me. The exhibition part I'm more comfortable. So it's more like an invitation for you to join us and to help us on that specific matter. And let me know that I found your research very, very good and touching the right points around performance documentation. That is very, very difficult for us. Mm-hmm. And it should include more voices than the technical voice that we had in the backstage at museums. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. We'll definitely join.
Great. I'm glad you found each other already. And then I know at least another colleague who is not in this room at the moment who was really interested in your work. So I will make sure to give her your contacts. I was wondering, can you tell a little bit more how in practice, you said that now people are testing your model. So can you give an example? What are they doing?
So as an embedded researcher, I've been part of a network several times, kind of testing the model. And it begins really when you get in touch with the artist once they have a concept. And you get interview questions, getting to know them, documenting their process, and then being ready for the live performance. So actually anticipating what you're going to document, whether that's via photography or videography, if you'll be doing evaluation of the audiences, but actually having an idea going into it rather than showing up and snapping what you can, but often losing a good deal of documentation potential. And then after the performance, going back and kind of analyzing and evaluating how it went, what changed in the future, if this was to be iterated once again, how that would be done, what the principles and kind of conditions around that might be. So really, really building up a complete portfolio of how the work was developed and what the future of that work might be.
Thank you. That sounds very practical. And now it looks to me that we have been a little bit too much afraid of this performance documentation, because to me it looks like when you have once thought what you want to do and then you do it and do it again, that's practically what it is. But you need to plan and have the communication with the artist to agree what is important, what they really want to leave behind from their performance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to ask a question? There are not currently anything online, but I will encourage people to post their questions even later if you have something in your mind. I think this is it. Everybody is satisfied with your presentation and with your answers, and probably looking forward to the coffee break. So thank you, Erin, for being here with us today.